The photograph slid beneath the saucer so smoothly that anyone watching might have mistaken it for shadow. Ilawan Lorne's fingers didn't tremble as she placed the coffee before Lucan Vallejo, though her pulse hammered against her ribs hard enough to bruise from the inside. The handwritten words on that hidden image would either save her life or end it within the next 10 minutes. The glass tide occupied a converted warehouse on Portland's waterfront, where exposed brick met polished maritime wood, and the distant cry of gulls provided soundtrack to whispered negotiations. Amber pendant lights cast pools of warmth across tables, spaced far enough apart that conversations remained private, close enough that power could recognize itself across the room. The establishment attracted a particular clientele, those who preferred their business conducted in elegance rather than back alleys. Ilawan had worked behind the bar for 8 months, learning to read the room's temperature by the weight of silence between spoken words. She knew which patrons ordered bourbon to celebrate, and which used it to postpone decisions they'd already made. Her ability to remain unnoticed had kept her alive this long, moving through the space like carefully controlled smoke. Lucan Vallejo arrived every Thursday at 9, claiming the corner table that offered views of both entrances and the kitchen door. His presence didn't announce itself through volume or display, but through the way conversations adjusted their pitch when he entered, how other patrons recalibrated their posture without conscious thought. He never ordered. His usual appeared, because the staff had learned that anticipation ensured survival. Tonight felt different from the moment Ilawan tied her apron strings. The 2 men near the window had arrived separately, but their eyes moved in synchronized patterns, tracking her movements with predatory focus. She'd first noticed them 3 days ago in the parking garage where she left her car. The photograph tucked against her skin had been taken by a friend who worked at the medical clinic, insurance against the moment when running alone would no longer be possible. 6 months of hiding her pregnancy beneath loose black shirts and strategic posture had bought her time, but time had expired the moment those men started following. Lucan lifted his cup with movements that suggested he had all the time in the world, though his eyes caught hers for exactly 2 seconds. In that brief connection, she saw calculation rather than surprise, recognition of a message delivered rather than confusion at its method. The steam rising from his coffee created patterns in the amber light, while the piano player transitioned into something minor and melancholic. Other patrons continued their conversations, unaware that the evening's careful balance had shifted into something far more dangerous. Behind the bar, Ilawan's hands moved through familiar motions, wiping glasses, arranging bottles, the small rituals that kept her grounded when fear threatened to crack her composure. The men by the window ordered cognac they didn't drink, their attention never wavering from her silhouette. She'd memorized every exit in the building during her first week of employment, counting steps and timing the door locks with the thoroughness of someone who understood that survival required preparation. The service entrance led to an alley that connected to 3 different streets, offering options if running became necessary. Lucan set down his cup and extracted the photograph, with movements disguised as adjusting his cufflinks. The image showed her in profile, the curve of her abdomen unmistakable despite the careful camera angle. On the reverse, her handwriting spelled out desperation in blue ink. "I'm pregnant. 6 months. They followed me. Run." His expression revealed nothing as he tucked the photograph into his jacket pocket, but one of his men materialized from the shadows near the hallway. Words weren't exchanged, only a slight gesture that sent the man toward the side exit with purposeful stride. The glass tide's atmosphere remained unchanged. Soft music, quieter conversations, the gentle clink of ice against crystal. But beneath that surface calm, Ilawan felt the current shifting, pulling her toward a moment where choices would be made by forces beyond her control. Lucan's mind processed threat assessment with the efficiency of long practice, cataloging every face in the room against his mental database of known operators and potential problems. The 2 men by the window carried themselves with military precision, poorly disguised as casual interest, their suits too structured for tourists, too generic for legitimate business. The photograph burned in his pocket not from heat, but from implication. Someone desperate enough to risk this method of communication had already exhausted safer options. Her handwriting showed education and control, despite circumstances that would break most people. Each letter formed with care even in crisis. 6 months pregnant meant vulnerability that extended beyond physical limitation into legal exposure and emotional leverage. The men following her understood this, which meant they wanted either the woman or the child or both, for reasons that wouldn't involve mercy. His second-in-command exited through the kitchen without drawing attention. beginning the process of determining who these watchers worked for and how many others waited outside. Information would arrive within minutes through channels Lucan had spent years establishing, networks that touched every corner of Portland's underground economy. Elowen continued her work behind the bar with mechanical precision, but he noticed the way her left hand occasionally pressed against her abdomen in protective gesture quickly suppressed. She'd hidden the pregnancy well. The loose clothing and strategic movement had fooled casual observation, though now that he knew what to look for, the signs seemed obvious. The cognac the watchers had ordered sat untouched on their table, condensation forming rings on the polished wood. They weren't even pretending to drink, too focused on their surveillance to maintain proper cover, which suggested either arrogance or desperation on their employer's part. Lucan lifted his phone and typed a message that would activate protocols designed for exactly this type of situation. 3 vehicles would reposition within 2 minutes, creating exit options and blocking potential ambush points. His people moved like water, filling spaces before problems could fully form. The barista, who usually worked opposite Elowen, had called in sick tonight. Convenient timing that might be coincidence, or might indicate that tonight's trap had been carefully orchestrated. He filed that detail away for later investigation, prioritizing immediate threats over questions that required leisure to answer properly. Through the window behind the watchers, Lucan spotted a dark sedan with engine running, positioned where it could monitor both main exits. The driver remained invisible behind tinted glass, but exhaust vapor in the cold night air betrayed the vehicle's readiness for sudden movement. His phone vibrated with incoming intelligence. The watchers were contracted security, military background, currently employed by Drexler Shipping, a front company for smuggling operations that had been expanding aggressively into territories that overlapped with Lucan's interests. The connection snapped into focus like bones setting after a break. Drexler's operation specialized in moving high-value items that couldn't cross borders through legitimate channels, but recent rumors suggested they'd diversified into human trafficking. A pregnant woman with no family ties would represent inventory rather than a person, especially if the child could be sold separately after birth. Elowen met his gaze again, and this time he saw the question beneath her careful composure, whether she'd made a catastrophic mistake trusting him, or found the only person in Portland capable of standing between her and the predators circling closer. Her eyes held steady despite the fear he could read in the tension of her shoulders. Lucan had built his position through calculated risk, and the ability to recognize when conventional thinking would lead to conventional failure. Helping her broke several unwritten rules about involvement in others' problems, but those rules had been written by men who'd never understood that power meant nothing without the will to use it for purposes beyond simple accumulation. The piano player finished his set and began packing his instrument, the absence of music making the room's conversation suddenly more audible. Someone laughed near the bar, the sound jarring against the tension that Lucan could feel building like pressure before a storm. He stood in a single fluid motion that drew every eye in the room before conversations resumed their careful dance. The watchers tensed, hands moving toward jacket pockets in synchronized movement that confirmed their training and their intent. Lucan walked toward the bar with the unhurried pace of someone who owned not just the moment, but every moment that would follow. Elowen's hand trembled as she reached for a wine glass on the top shelf, and the stemware slipped from her fingers before she could correct her grip. Crystal exploded against tile floor with sound that cracked through the room's carefully maintained atmosphere like a gunshot through silk. Every head turned toward the bar, conversations stopping mid-sentence as attention focused on the scattered shards reflecting amber light in fractured patterns. She stepped back from the broken glass, her face showing exactly the right amount of embarrassment and apology that any server would display after such a mistake. But Lucan saw what others missed, the way she'd positioned herself near the service door during that backward step, how her body had already turned 30 degrees toward the exit. The broken glass wasn't accident but signal, the manufactured distraction of someone who'd learned to create opportunities from apparent failure. She disappeared through the service door before the watching crowd could return to their conversations, moving with speed that suggested she'd rehearsed this exact escape multiple times in her mind. The door swung shut behind her with a soft click that somehow carried more weight than the shattered crystal. The 2 watchers rose simultaneously, their pretense of casual presence abandoned in favor of immediate pursuit. The taller one moved toward the service door while his partner headed for the main entrance, executing a pincer movement designed to cut off escape routes with professional efficiency. Lucan's people intercepted them with the smoothness of choreographed performance, his head of security materializing beside the taller watcher with offer of assistance cleaning the broken glass, another of his men blocking the main entrance while fumbling with his phone in apparent distraction. The delays lasted only seconds, but seconds could mean the difference between capture and freedom. Outside, Portland's November fog rolled in from the harbor thick enough to reduce streetlights to diffused halos of yellow struggling against the darkness. The temperature had dropped below 40 degrees, and moisture hung in the air like suspended rain waiting for permission to fall. Elowen's footsteps echoed in the alley behind the glass tide as she ran toward the street access point she'd memorized during those first careful weeks of employment. Her breath came in controlled bursts, despite the fear flooding her system with adrenaline, discipline overriding panic through sheer force of will. A small blue sedan waited at the alley's end, engine off but positioned for rapid departure, her exit vehicle purchased with cash from a seller who hadn't asked questions. She'd kept the car parked in rotating locations for 3 weeks, moving it every few days to prevent patterns that watchers could exploit. But as she reached for the door handle, movement at the alley's opposite end made her freeze with hand extended. A third man emerged from the shadows, blocking her retreat path, his silhouette backlit by distant streetlights suggesting size and capability that made her previous fears seem almost quaint. Her options collapsed into a single point of absolute clarity. Forward meant capture. Backward meant capture. Staying still meant capture. The baby moved inside her, a flutter of motion that felt like question or accusation or both simultaneously, asking why she'd waited so long to run, why she'd believed she could hide forever. Then headlights swept across the alley entrance, as a black SUV turned in with the controlled aggression of predator responding to prey's flight attempt. The vehicle stopped precisely between her and the approaching man, passenger door opening before the engine fully settled into idle. Lucan's voice carried through the fog with command that allowed no space for debate or hesitation. "Get in. Now." His tone held neither warmth nor coldness, just the absolute certainty of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question or delay. Elowen's survival instinct warred with every warning she'd ever learned about entering vehicles with dangerous men, but the approaching footsteps behind her and the blocked escape route ahead removed the luxury of deliberation. She dove into the passenger seat with movements made clumsy by pregnancy and desperation. The door slammed shut, and the SUV accelerated before she'd fully settled into the leather seat, its engine responding with power that pressed her back against the headrest. Through the rear window, she watched the third man sprint toward his own vehicle, while the two from inside the glass tide emerged into the alley seconds too late to prevent her departure. The SUV carved through Portland's fog-thick streets with precision that suggested Lucan knew every turn before the road revealed it. Elowen pressed one hand against the dashboard to steady herself as they took a corner fast enough to make the tires protest, the other hand instinctively protecting her abdomen from impacts that never came. Behind them, headlights appeared and disappeared in the murky darkness, like predatory eyes blinking through camouflage. The pursuit vehicle maintained distance rather than closing aggressively, which told Lucan they were tracking, rather than attempting immediate interception. His jaw tightened as he processed the tactical implications of being followed versus being attacked. How many knew about the pregnancy? His question cut through the engine noise without preamble or gentleness, demanding information with the efficiency of someone for whom time represented luxury he couldn't afford. Elowen's voice emerged steadier than she'd expected, muscle memory from years of hiding fear beneath competent performance. 3 people. The clinic nurse who took the photograph, her sister who developed it, and now you. She watched his profile in the dashboard's green glow, searching for reaction that never surfaced on features carved from something harder than mere flesh. The commercial district gave way to industrial waterfront where warehouses stood like sleeping giants against the harbor's invisible presence. Lucan killed the headlights and navigated by memory through streets where functioning lamps had become rare as honest conversation. The darkness swallowed them completely, and the following vehicle's lights disappeared as their driver faced the choice between revealing position or losing the trail. They stopped behind a fish processing plant that had closed 3 seasons ago, its windows boarded and its loading docks surrendered to rust and sea air. Lucan's phone glowed briefly as he sent messages that would ripple outward through his network, activating resources and closing gaps before problems could exploit them. "The men following you work for Drexler Shipping." He stated this as fact rather than theory, watching her face for confirmation or surprise. "They specialize in moving cargo that screams when it doesn't want to be moved." The implications crashed over Elowen like cold water, stealing breath she struggled to reclaim. Her brother had worked for Drexler before his death 6 months ago, the same brother whose final words warned her to disappear before they realized what he'd told her. She'd been running ever since, changing apartments 3 times before landing at the Glass Tide. My brother discovered they were trafficking children through shipping containers modified with ventilation systems. Her words emerged flat, drained of emotion through repetition in her own mind during sleepless nights. He was going to turn evidence over to federal investigators. They found him in the harbor before he could make the meeting. Lucan absorbed this information with the stillness of deep water concealing dangerous currents beneath calm surface. The brother's death explained the pregnancy's significance. Drexler couldn't risk the child carrying genetic evidence that might link back to their operation if the brother had documented anything biological. Loose ends required cutting regardless of innocence or guilt. They think the baby might be valuable. Elowen continued, her voice gaining strength from finally speaking truths she'd carried alone for half a year. Either as leverage if my brother left evidence somewhere, or as insurance if anyone else asks questions about what happened to him. A sound outside made them both freeze. Footsteps on gravel, careful and measured, approaching from the direction they'd entered. Lucan's hand moved to his waistband with practiced economy of motion, extracting a weapon that seemed natural extension of his arm, rather than separate tool. But the footsteps belonged to his head of security, who emerged from the darkness with phone extended showing a map of the surrounding area. Red dots marked hostile positions, while blue indicated friendly forces, the tactical situation updating in real time as various players adjusted to the evening's unexpected developments. We have 4 vehicles in pursuit formation, 2 more setting up probable ambush points near the marina exits. The security chief's voice carried the professional detachment of someone reporting weather, rather than mortal danger. They're coordinating through encrypted radio, military-grade equipment, which means Drexler's pulling actual combat personnel for this operation. Lucan studied the map with eyes that translated colored dots into human lives and probable outcomes. Pull everyone back to defensive perimeter around the warehouse district. Let them think they're hurting us somewhere while we move to the boat slip at Pier 19. His strategy emerged fully formed, suggesting he'd wargamed scenarios like this countless times before needing them. The security chief vanished back into darkness, while Lucan turned his attention to Elowen, with assessment that felt almost clinical in its thoroughness. Can you swim? The question seemed absurd given her pregnancy, until she understood he was calculating every possible variable, planning for contingencies that hadn't yet materialized but might within the next hour. The safe house occupied the basement level of a marine supply warehouse, where Lucan's legitimate business interests provided cover for less public operations. Concrete walls sweated moisture that smelled of salt and diesel, while exposed pipes overhead carried sounds from the building above in distorted echoes that made location impossible to determine. Elowen descended the metal stairs with one hand on the railing and the other supporting her lower back, pregnancy making the steep angle treacherous. Emergency lighting cast everything in shades of gray and amber, creating shadows that moved wrong when she shifted position. A folding cot had been set up in the corner nearest the bathroom, blankets stacked with military precision beside bottles of water and basic medical supplies. The space felt less like sanctuary and more like holding cell, though she understood beggars didn't negotiate amenities when survival remained uncertain. Lucan positioned himself where he could watch both the stairway entrance and the emergency exit that led to the harborside loading dock. His phone continued its steady stream of messages as his organization adapted to the crisis, resources shifting like chess pieces, responding to an opponent's unexpected gambit. The nurse who took the photograph. He didn't look at Elowen when he spoke. Attention divided between phone and stairwell. Where is she now? The question landed like physical blow because Elowen had been avoiding that particular mathematics since fleeing the Glass Tide. Her apartment in the old port district. She was supposed to leave town tonight, take her sister and drive to Montreal where they have family. The words emerged hollow because she knew what Lucan's next question would be before he asked it. You gave her enough warning? His tone carried no judgment, just the cold assessment of someone calculating casualties and acceptable losses. Elowen's silence answered more thoroughly than words could manage. She'd planned to call after her shift ended, giving herself plausible deniability if Drexler's people were monitoring her phone. The broken glass and sudden escape had accelerated everything, collapsing timelines she'd carefully constructed into chaos that swallowed contingency plans. Lucan made 3 rapid phone calls, his voice shifting into command mode that brooked no questions or delays. He dispatched people to the nurse's address with instructions that sounded like extraction procedures, the kind of operation that assumed hostility and planned accordingly. The baby kicked hard enough to make Elowen gasp, a reminder that her body continued its biological imperative regardless of circumstances that made new life seem like cosmic joke. She'd stopped imagining the future weeks ago, focusing only on surviving the present moment, and then the next one after that. "Why are you helping me?" The question escaped before she could suppress it. Vulnerability she'd worked hard to eliminate showing through cracks in her carefully maintained composure. Lucan finally looked directly at her, and his eyes held calculation, but also something else. Recognition, perhaps, or memory of being the one who needed help before becoming the one who provided it. "Because Drexler operates in my city without permission, which makes them a problem regardless of you." His answer disappointed her with its practicality, until he continued. "And because no one should have to run while pregnant from men who see children as merchandise." The honesty in that second statement felt more dangerous than any threat she'd faced tonight, because it suggested he possessed principles beneath the ruthless exterior. Principles created weaknesses that could be exploited, and she'd learned to trust survival instinct over apparent kindness. His phone buzzed with incoming message that made his expression harden into something that belonged on battlefield, rather than basement. "The nurse and her sister are secure. Found them packing with 3 of Drexler's people watching the building from a vehicle across the street." He typed rapid responses while speaking. "My people extracted them through the building service entrance before the watchers realized what happened." Relief flooded through Elowen with enough force to make her dizzy. The knowledge that her mistake hadn't cost innocent lives lifting weight she'd been carrying since the moment crystals shattered on the glass tide's floor. She sat heavily on the cot, exhaustion crashing over her, now that adrenaline had nowhere productive to flow. "They'll know you're involved now." She stated the obvious because silence felt worse than speaking unnecessary truths. "Drexler will see the extraction as declaration." Lucan's smile contained no humor, just the cold satisfaction of predator who'd been waiting for excuse to hunt something that deserved hunting. "Good. Let them come looking. I prefer enemies who announce themselves over the ones who pretend to be something else." 3 days passed in the warehouse basement where time became theoretical concept, measured by shift changes of security personnel, rather than natural light. Elowen established routines because routine provided illusion of control. Waking at 7, walking the perimeter for exercise despite limited space, reading books that Lucan's people delivered without her requesting them. He arrived each evening at 9 precisely, descending the metal stairs with footsteps that announced his presence before he became visible. The visits followed pattern that felt almost ritualistic. Security briefing first, then questions about her physical condition, finally discussion of contingency plans if current situation deteriorated beyond management. She learned he preferred silence over unnecessary conversation, that he noticed small details like her preference for tea over coffee despite never asking directly. The books he provided shifted from generic fiction to specific titles about child development and pregnancy nutrition, suggesting he'd researched or consulted experts about her situation. On the 4th evening, he brought dinner instead of sending it down with security. Actual plates rather than disposable containers. The food from a restaurant she recognized as expensive even by Portland's inflated standards. He set everything on the folding table without explanation, as though sharing meals in concrete basements represented perfectly normal social engagement. "The nurse and her sister are in Montreal." He spoke while arranging silverware with more care than seemed necessary. "They won't be coming back. I've arranged documentation and employment that will make them invisible to anyone searching." Elowen absorbed this information while studying his profile in the harsh emergency lighting. "You didn't have to do that. Getting them out was enough." She kept her voice neutral, unwilling to show how much the gesture affected her. "Loose ends become nooses if you ignore them long enough." His practical answer deflected the gratitude she'd almost expressed, steering conversation back toward tactical considerations rather than emotional territory. "Drexler's been quiet for 72 hours, which means they're either planning something elaborate or waiting for us to make mistakes from boredom." The food tasted better than anything she'd eaten in months, though she couldn't determine if that reflected actual quality or simply the novelty of eating something not consumed alone while watching the stairwell for threats. They ate in silence that felt companionable rather than awkward, 2 people sharing space without requiring it to mean anything beyond immediate practical necessity. "How long can we stay here?" She finally asked the question that had been circling her thoughts like shark around wounded prey. The warehouse provided security, but not permanence, a distinction that mattered more with each day that brought her closer to delivery. Lucan set down his fork with the deliberate care of someone buying time to formulate response he knew she wouldn't want to hear. "As long as necessary" is the optimistic answer. "Realistically, we have maybe 2 weeks before staying becomes more dangerous than moving." He met her eyes directly when delivering bad news, at least granting her that much respect. And after 2 weeks, she kept eating despite nausea that had nothing to do with pregnancy, forcing herself to maintain appearance of calm, while her mind raced through scenarios that all ended badly. After 2 weeks, we shift to a property outside the city where medical care can be arranged discreetly. His answer came too smoothly, suggesting he'd already developed this plan, and simply waited for appropriate moment to reveal it. You'll have everything needed for the pregnancy's final stage and delivery, plus security that doesn't require hiding in basements. The offer contained generosity that triggered every warning instinct Elowen had developed through years of learning that gifts always carried prices not immediately visible. Why would you do that? You've already risked enough getting me out of the glass tide. She pushed her plate away, appetite vanishing beneath suspicion that coiled in her stomach like the baby's movements. Because Drexler made this personal when they hunted you in my establishment. Lucan's voice carried edge that suggested she'd insulted him by questioning motives he considered self-evident. They turned my property into their hunting ground without permission or tribute, which means they've forgotten how things work in this city. His anger felt genuine rather than manufactured for her benefit, pride wounded in ways that had nothing to do with her specifically, and everything to do with territory and respect. She recognized the psychology because she'd seen it before. Powerful men sometimes helped, because the alternative meant admitting they couldn't control their own domain. I won't be useful to you. She needed to establish this boundary before accepting help that might come with expectations she couldn't fulfill. Whatever war you're planning with Drexler, I can't be part of it. I need to focus on staying alive and getting this baby born safely. Lucan's expression shifted into something that might have been respect, if she'd been capable of reading his face more accurately. I'm not asking you to fight my battles. I'm telling you that helping you happens to align with eliminating a problem I needed excuse to address. He stood and collected the plates with movements that suggested conversation had reached its natural conclusion. Whether you trust my motives or not changes nothing about the situation. You're safer with me than without me. The attack came at 2:17 in the morning when human attention naturally reached its lowest ebb. Elowen woke to the sound of glass shattering somewhere above, followed by voices shouting commands in tones that carried military precision rather than criminal chaos. Lucan materialized at the bottom of the stairs before she'd fully processed what the sounds meant, his weapon drawn, and his free hand gesturing toward the emergency exit with urgency that required no verbal translation. She rolled off the cot with movements made clumsy by pregnancy and disorientation, grabbing the bag she'd kept packed by the bedside for exactly this scenario. The emergency lighting flickered and died, plunging the basement into darkness so complete it felt solid against her skin. She heard Lucan moving toward her position with confidence that suggested he'd memorized the space's layout, his hand finding her elbow with surprising gentleness given the circumstances. Stay behind me and keep one hand on my belt. His whispered instruction came from inches away, breath warm against her ear. We're going through the harbor exit to a boat that's waiting at the private slip. They move through the darkness with agonizing slowness, each step requiring verification before weight could shift forward. Above them, the sounds of forced entry intensified, doors being breached, furniture overturning, systematic room-by-room clearing that spoke to professional execution rather than desperate improvisation. Gunfire erupted somewhere on the building's main floor, the reports sharp and distinct, rather than the muffled percussion of suppressed weapons. Lucan's people were engaging the assault team, buying time measured in seconds rather than minutes, every bullet a mathematical exchange of violence against calculated outcome. The emergency exit door swung open on well-oiled hinges, revealing Portland's harbor wrapped in pre-dawn fog that reduced visibility to arm's length. The temperature had dropped further, moisture in the air creating conditions where sound traveled unpredictably, sometimes carrying for impossible distances, sometimes dying within feet of its source. Lucan pulled her through the door and onto the loading dock where wooden planks slick with condensation threatened stability with each step. A narrow walkway extended from the dock to a floating slip where a small powerboat waited with engine idling in neutral, its running lights extinguished to avoid drawing attention from anyone watching the harbor. Behind them, an explosion shook the warehouse with enough force to send vibrations through the dock's support pilings. Elowen stumbled, and Lucan's arm wrapped around her waist to steady her balance, his strength absorbing her weight without apparent effort as they continued toward the boat. Two figures emerged from the fog ahead, blocking access to the slip with weapons raised in professional firing stances. Lucan stopped so abruptly that Elowen collided with his back, the impact driving air from her lungs in an involuntary gasp that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden stillness. "Lower your weapons." Lucan's voice carried absolute authority despite their tactical disadvantage, the kind of command that assumed obedience even when circumstances suggested otherwise. "You're making a mistake that will cost more than Drexler's willing to pay." The taller of the two figures shifted stance slightly, weapon tracking to maintain sight alignment as targets moved. "We have orders to bring the woman in alive. You get to choose whether that happens over your corpse or with you walking away." The voice belonged to someone accustomed to delivering ultimatums, confidence born from superior position and numerical advantage. Time compressed into a moment where breathing seemed to require conscious effort, where Elowen could feel her heartbeat in her fingertips and taste copper fear on her tongue. The baby kicked hard against her ribs as though sensing the danger, or perhaps just reacting to the adrenaline flooding her system through shared bloodstream. Then muzzle flashes erupted from the boat at the slip, and both figures ahead crumpled to the dock's wooden planking before they could return fire. Lucan's backup had been positioned perfectly, waiting for targets to reveal themselves before eliminating the threat with shots that spoke to professional training and complete commitment to their employer's protection. The powerboat cut through fog-shrouded harbor waters with throttle restricted to minimize engine noise, navigation lights remaining dark as they relied on GPS and local knowledge to avoid commercial traffic lanes. Elowen sat in the small cabin wrapped in a blanket that smelled of diesel and old canvas, her body trembling from delayed shock rather than cold. Lucan stood at the helm with phone pressed to his ear, receiving damage reports and casualty counts that painted the assault's aftermath in numbers too clinical for the violence they represented. 3 of his people wounded, 1 critically, 0 fatalities on his side. Drexler's assault team had suffered 4 dead and 2 captured, ratios that would force uncomfortable conversations within their organization about cost versus benefit. The boat approached a private dock on one of the harbor islands that wealthy Portland residents maintained for summer homes they occupied 3 months per year. November meant the properties stood empty, protected only by basic security systems that Lucan's people had already disabled through methods that wouldn't trigger alerts at monitoring stations. They disembarked onto a floating dock that rose and fell with harbor swells, the movement requiring careful attention that pregnancy made more treacherous. Elowen accepted Lucan's offered hand without hesitation this time, pride becoming luxury she couldn't afford when stumbling meant potential harm to the baby. The house beyond the dock belonged to an architect who designed it to maximize harbor views through floor-to-ceiling windows that now revealed only fog and darkness. Lucan led her through rooms furnished with the expensive minimalism of people who confused empty space with sophistication, stopping in a bedroom that faced away from the harbor toward the island's wooded interior. "We'll stay here until dawn, then move again." He checked his phone while speaking, messages arriving in steady stream as his organization adapted to the night's developments. "Drexler crossed a line attacking my property directly. The response needs to be proportional and educational." Elowen sank onto the bed's edge, exhaustion crashing over her with enough force to make simple sitting seem like accomplishment worth celebrating. "Educational," she repeated, tasting the word's implications. "You're going to kill them." Statement rather than question, because she'd learned to recognize intent beneath diplomatic phrasing. "I'm going to remove a problem that threatens my operations and endangered someone under my protection." Lucan's correction shifted responsibility from personal revenge to professional necessity, the kind of rationalization that probably helped him sleep at night. What happens to Drexler depends on how they respond to conversations that will begin tomorrow. The pragmatism in his approach should have disturbed her more than it did, but 6 months of running had recalibrated her moral compass in ways she'd once have found unthinkable. She'd learned that survival sometimes required accepting help from people who solved problems through methods that wouldn't survive ethical scrutiny. "I can't keep running like this." Her voice emerged smaller than intended, vulnerability she'd fought to suppress finally finding words. "The baby's due in less than 3 months. I need stability, medical care, somewhere I can actually prepare, instead of just reacting to whatever comes next." Lucan moved to the window and stood with hands clasped behind his back, silhouette framed against fog-diffused lights from distant shore. "There's a property 2 hours north, closer to the Canadian border. Medical facility on site, discreet staff who understand the importance of discretion, security that makes tonight's assault look like children playing soldier." He turned to face her, expression unreadable in the darkness. "You'd be safe there through delivery and beyond." The offer contained everything she needed, but accepting it meant binding herself to someone whose protection came with debts not yet defined. "What do you want in return?" She needed the price stated explicitly, rather than discovering it later when refusing became impossible. I want Drexler to understand that Portland operates under rules they forgot or never learned. His answer avoided her actual question, while revealing something perhaps more honest, that helping her served purposes beyond her individual situation. Your safety accomplishes that by denying them what they sought to take. She studied his face in the dim light filtering through fog-covered windows, searching for deception, and finding only the cold calculation of someone who'd learned that power meant nothing without the will to use it strategically. And after the baby's born, after Drexler learns whatever lesson you're teaching, what happens when I'm no longer useful to your purposes? Then you'll have choices you don't currently possess. He delivered this with the certainty of someone accustomed to having his word accepted as binding contract. I'll provide documentation, resources to establish yourself anywhere you choose, protection until you're beyond reach of anyone still holding grudges. 2 months later, Elowen stood in a medical facility that resembled upscale spa more than hospital, her daughter asleep in her arms wrapped in blankets, soft enough to feel like cloud rather than fabric. The delivery had proceeded without complications, attended by professionals who asked no questions about circumstances that brought pregnant woman to remote location for childbirth. Lucan had visited twice during those months, once to verify security arrangements met his standards, once more 3 days before delivery to ensure medical team understood the assignment's sensitive nature. Both visits maintained the professional distance that had characterized their interactions since the harbor escape, though she'd caught him watching her with expression she couldn't quite decode. The baby had her father's eyes, a man who'd died trying to protect children from the same organization that had hunted his sister. Elowen had named her daughter after no one, giving her fresh start unconnected to the past's accumulated tragedies and compromises. The birth certificate listed no father, and the last name she'd chosen existed nowhere in her actual family history. Drexler Shipping had ceased operations 6 weeks earlier, following coordinated law enforcement raids that uncovered trafficking networks spanning 3 states. The evidence had appeared anonymously, delivered to multiple agencies simultaneously in packages too comprehensive to ignore or suppress. Lucan's hand in the operation remained invisible, but Elowen understood the mathematics of his revenge. The news coverage had been extensive, but carefully curated, focusing on the victims rescued rather than the power structures that had enabled their exploitation. Elowen watched the reports from her hospital room, recognizing names and locations from her brother's notes that she'd memorized before burning them. Justice had arrived through channels that bypassed traditional limitations, delivered by someone who understood that some problems required solutions the law couldn't officially sanction. She'd written Lucan a letter during those first weeks after delivery, attempting to articulate gratitude that felt inadequate, regardless of word choice. The letter remained in her bag, unfinished and unsent, because she'd realized that their arrangement existed beyond language's ability to define it. He'd offered protection without demanding performance of gratitude, and responding with forced sentiment would cheapen what had passed between them into something transactional, and therefore diminished. She'd declined the offer to stay at the facility beyond the recommended recovery period, accepting instead the documentation and financial resources he'd promised. A new identity, employment history that would survive background checks, and bank account containing enough money to establish herself anywhere she chose to begin again. The drive south took her through small coastal towns that offered anonymity through sheer ordinariness, places where no one cared about past lives because everyone maintained their own careful secrets. She stopped in a town whose name she'd selected from map based purely on distance from Portland and proximity to Canadian border. 3 months after settling into rented cottage overlooking gray Atlantic waters, she received package delivered by courier who accepted signature and departed without conversation. Inside, she found single photograph showing her and the baby on the cottage's porch, morning sunlight catching them both in moment of casual peace. The image had been taken from distance using professional equipment, close enough to capture detail but far enough to suggest surveillance rather than intimate proximity. On the photograph's reverse, handwriting she recognized from security briefings written in blue ink, confirmed safe, will check quarterly, LV. The message's brevity contained more reassurance than lengthy explanation could have provided. He'd kept his word about protection extending beyond immediate usefulness, the quarterly checks representing insurance policy against threats that might emerge from darkness she'd escaped. She placed the photograph in drawer beside the ultrasound images from her pregnancy, documentation of journey from desperate barista to protected mother. The cottage's isolation suited her perfectly, close enough to town for necessities, far enough that neighbors respected privacy through simple absence of proximity. On evening in November, exactly 1 year after the photograph had slid beneath Lucan's coffee saucer at the Glass Tide, Elowen made decision that felt simultaneously reckless and necessary. She printed a photograph of herself holding her daughter on the cottage's porch, both healthy and genuinely smiling, light catching them in moment that suggested peace rather than mere survival. On the photograph's reverse, she wrote in careful blue ink, "Thank you." 2 words that carried weight of gratitude she'd never properly expressed. Acknowledgement of protection that had allowed her daughter to exist beyond someone's nightmare calculation of value and threat. She mailed it to address listed on the quarterly check documentation, trusting it would reach intended recipient through whatever channels he'd established. Weeks later, response arrived as single text message from unknown number. "You're welcome. Stay safe." The number disconnected immediately after sending disposable communication that maintained his pattern of professional distance. She deleted the message and returned to routines she'd built around her daughter's needs, allowing herself to believe that safety might actually mean what the word suggested, rather than simply describing temporary absence of immediate danger. Thank you all for following this story. If you've enjoyed it, write in the comments which part of the world you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Your support means everything and helps me continue bringing these stories to life. Until next time, stay safe and remember, sometimes the most dangerous escapes lead to the most unexpected sanctuaries.